and grab one today. We are actually going to look at the Bible. What? I know. Shocking.
Bible study, and we're using the Bible. Goodness gracious.
Woo, boy. Just because I know a lot of people are wondering about it, the issue with the sound system is that it's literally falling apart. It's not settings or anything like that. There's a cable that runs from the soundboard back to the main speakers, and that cable is like 50 years old, and it's undersized actually for what we need. And also there's a short in it. So every Sunday I have to go and wiggle that cable until it stops humming. But even then, I literally just can't get enough volume out of the speakers without creating feedback. John Baker is actually, he's got somebody that he knows that's a sound tech that's going to get a quote for doing some, at least getting a new cable, but then also I would love to get a digital mobile soundboard so we can get rid of that whole footprint there.
Can you get batteries to put in the car?
Oh. I just changed those. I don't know.
Did John tell you on Tuesday night?
You're next thing. No, it's okay.
You're next.
On Tuesday night.
Well, we were doing rehearsal with Brown's sister.
Yeah.
Losing like sound.
That's why they set up the secondary soundboard.
And he does, and I think that's what he's going to do.
Yeah.
There is a conduit already in place that house that.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's not a hard thing. It's just we need a new snake. Yeah. Technology has increased, and also the new ones are shielded as well too. Whereas that one, it looks like it's just basically a speaker wire. Yeah. Yeah. We need we need a thing. Yeah. All right. Sorry, we ran really long today. My sermon was partly to blame. The choir was partly to blame. Also, don't you just love being in church, anyways? Were there any sports games that I ran over for? I don't know, probably.
You're the only one that seems anxious to get out of here.
Okay, good. All right. Well, it's just that I always try to keep it around an hour, right? Plus or minus 5 minutes, I'm okay. But if it runs to like quarter after, 20 after, I don't know. Person of St. Luke, right? We've already discussed a little bit, but we're going to get into in-depth of who Luke was and why that is important in our reading of Scripture. And then we are going to look at a couple of different passages in Luke that we can compare contrast with the other Gospels and talk about, what's similar, which one of these things is not like the others, that fun game that we always do. So first things first, let's talk about who Luke was. First, fun information. Does anybody know when St. Luke's feast day is? It's proximal to It's proximal to St. Francis's feast day and Reformation Sunday. It's October. October 18th is St. Luke's feast day. Okay, so here, as with all of the gospel characters, how do I say, who St. Luke was, whether or not he wrote the Luke Acts, gospel stuff, all of that is constantly under debate. However, with Luke at least, we have a pretty good picture of number one, who Luke was. We have a pretty good picture of that. Number two, we have good reason to believe that is the person that actually wrote the Luke Acts chunk of text. Okay. However, as with all things, like I already mentioned, it's constantly under debate, because this is why scholars need to have things to debate, because otherwise they don't have jobs. I'm being a little bit snarky there. But this is, there are PhD candidates right now that are looking for things to write their doctoral thesis on, and arguing the validity of St. Luke as the gospel author is probably one of those. So, welcome to the world of scholarship. Okay, so who was Luke? Okay, first and maybe most important piece of information is that he was what we refer to as a secondary apostle. So Luke was not one of the 12. There are two kind of prevailing different theories, and they are not actually mutually exclusive either. One is that he was a part of the 70. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say the 70? So common tradition is that beyond the 12, there was also kind of a second, not a second tier, but a second ring of apostles that were with Jesus, right? And were probably recruited by the apostles themselves, right? It was support staff, I guess, right? That, were part of that movement. And so the 70 is just kind of like a catch-all term for all the apostles that get referenced but aren't part of the 12. Whether or not there were actually 70 doesn't matter. The point is that 70 refers to everybody else. All right, so the 70 includes like Mary Magdalene, Mary Martha, Lazarus, all of Barnabas, all of these characters that we read about in the gospel witness, but aren't numbered amongst the 12 men that follow Jesus, right? Which I thought that's a whole other conversation. So some traditions hold that Luke was part of the 70. One thing we do know for sure is that Luke and Paul were pretty tight, okay? Luke's home base is regarded as Antioch. Does everybody know where Antioch is? Not to be confused with Antioch University. Antioch was a Roman city that is in modern-day Turkey. Okay, there is also a Syrian, not Assyrian, a Syrian Antioch. Okay, two places named similarly, so we know for sure, probably, most likely, that Luke was a Gentile. Okay, and this is what is really cool about this. This is one of the things that matches up with the tradition of the Gospel of Luke. Is one of the things we talked about last week is that the Gospel of Luke is written in a way that Mark or Matthew is not, and that it's written really intentionally towards a broader witness, right? Is that it was expansive in terms of who was included in the language that was used. So we're moving past just a reading of the gospel that is about the redemption of Israel, and we're moving now into a reading of the gospel that is a global, even a cosmic redemption, right? So what we get within Luke, and we'll look at this in a little bit, is no longer language that's specifically tied into Jewish people or Israelites, but now intentionally includes Gentiles within that witness, which makes sense because Luke was somebody that actually worked with Paul. And Paul, of course, is the person within the Christian tradition who is responsible for, well, not singularly, but he is one of the major players, one of the major key players who is responsible for disseminating the gospel, spreading the gospel into quote-unquote Gentile lands, right? So have you ever, and one of these days I'll set up the projector so we can actually take a look at it, but have you ever seen maps of Paul's three journeys, right? Have you watched how those go? Yeah. Which is really a kind of a cool thing to think about, knowing how long that took just to make the journey itself, right? He couldn't catch a flight from Jerusalem to Philippi and be preaching the next Sunday. No, he was taking boats. He was taking seafaring vessels and had many adventures because of that. One of the stories of Paul, of course, is the story of the shipwreck and all that comes along with that. So Luke, we know, was an agent working with Paul in spreading the gospel into these regions. And we can imagine potentially that, Luke's home base being Antioch, he was potentially spreading the gospel to one of these 7 churches that we read about in John's Revelation. Now, again, this is all kind of imagining or conjecture. But this is stuff that, we can't for sure confirm, but, we can kind of imagine and guess and say that, this may be, who Luke was and what he was up to. Now, the most popular or the most prevalent counter to this is that Luke was a Hellenic Jew. Okay, So the difference, of course, being, excuse me, and it kind of boils down to semantics somewhat. The difference, of course, being if we're saying Luke is a Gentile, that means that Luke, A, is not circumcised, B, does not see himself as Jewish, okay? In being a Christian, he identifies as a Greek person who is following the Christ. In calling him a Hellenic Jew, what we're saying is that Luke is somebody from Hellenic heritage, Greek, Turkish, whatever, who converted to Judaism and then decided to follow Jesus. Okay, again, kind of seems like semantics, but really actually is pretty important. And the reason that we tend to hold the tradition of him being a Gentile as the prevailing, most important one is because of the nature of what is in the Luke Acts narrative and how much the author of these narratives really emphasizes the I was going to say galactic reach of Jesus's reign, which we could absolutely say as well too, right? Really emphasizes the inclusivity of Gentiles within this, and highlights as well the conflict that occurs between Gentile and Jewish Christians. We don't get so much of that in the Luke Acts narrative. That's more in Paul's letters, but it is present there. One of the fun pieces of information is that Luke Acts makes up more than a quarter of the New Testament. Were you aware of that? Right? So if you were to grab your Bible and pinch the Luke Acts, which you can't do because John is in between it, stinking John. Take that section. That is over a quarter of the New Testament, because despite the fact that Paul was a prolific writer of letters, his letters, with a couple of exceptions, are not that lengthy, right? Letter to the Philippians is only 4 chapters. It'll come to me in a moment. But anyways, Romans is pretty long. Obviously, there is 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There were actually 3 letters to the Corinthians. We don't have the 3rd one. But those were long letters. Galatians is short-ish, right? But even sticking all of Paul's stuff together, it comes out about equal to the length of the Luke Acts narrative. And then, of course, you've got the other 3 Gospels, you've got the Revelation, then you've got the pastoral epistles that make up the balance of the Gospel. Luke, in tradition, was a Greek-trained physician. This is attested to specifically by, Colossians? No, by a guy named Epiphanius. Boy, poor Greg, who had to read the Acts text this morning. I was like, glad it's not me. But long story short, Luke, and this is, what's fun about Luke is that we have enough contemporary textual witnesses that really attest to who Luke was. Now, again, we don't know Luke's backstory beyond these few things. We don't know, what his life was like as a child, and why he ended up where he ended up at. But we do know, who he was to a certain extent, what he was involved in, and again, to a certain extent, what his interests, were, what his shall I say, theology, philosophy was. And again, not to overemphasize this, but a large part of, apparently, who Luke was wanting to reconcile Gentile personage within the ministry of Jesus, right? Which is great. It fits into our timeline as well, too. Already mentioning, during this time is the great expansion of Christianity into, quote unquote, Gentile lands. Is there anything else that I want to mention?
When you said he was a physician.
Yeah.
Physicians at that time were
not surgeons.
Yeah, no, but I mean more holistic.
Well, no, not necessarily. So, one of the things that we often forget is that science and medicine had reached a pinnacle during the days of the Roman Empire. In fact, medicine in general regresses greatly post-fall of the Western Roman Empire. That's when we get leeches and humors and all that stuff that makes up the context of medieval medicine. But practicing as a physician during in the context of the Roman Empire. I can't tell you exactly what that means, but he would have gone through a pretty rigorous education program. Obviously, would have been would have been literate, probably read and spoke. Good Lord. Greek, potentially Aramaic or Hebrew. If he's walking around with Paul and these guys, and because of that, would have been an extremely valuable asset to the Christian movement during that time. Because having somebody who's Gentile born that's able to navigate that world is invaluable. Yeah, but good question. That's something I can look up to. I have never actually researched what first century Roman medicine looked like. But again, I do know that it was more advanced than the medicine to follow.
Now, when you wrote these 4 chapters, and I'm just imagining on papyrus, a letter was pretty lengthy. You couldn't take very many.
Oh, for like Paul writing his letters? Yeah. Well, and this, by the way, I shouldn't say that. This indicates to us as well that Paul had funding. If he was able to acquire writing materials, even while in prison, right? Prison was much different, by the way, in first century, Roman world. It was not max security, triple lockdown that we're accustomed with. It was much more comfortable in certain cases. You did not want to be an enemy of the empire, that's for sure. But generally speaking, Paul being in prison was more like being in house arrest. For the most part. There's the one occasion where there's the earthquake that knocks down the wall, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, being able to have the material resources to write these letters indicates a bunch of things. It indicates that they had wealth and resources to be able to acquire this stuff. But number 2, it also indicates that people valued Paul's words a whole lot, right? The fact that Paul is writing these letters to these different congregations, because all of Paul's letters are directed at specific communities, right? So it's in the introductions of all these letters as well too. Like first and 2nd and 3rd Corinthians is to the churches in Corinth. Philippians is to the church in Philippi. Thessalonians is to the church in Thessalonica, right? So these are directed at specific communities. But the fact that people not only received and transported these letters and then read them aloud to their community, because that was the intent and that was how they were used, but then kept and made copies of them going forward. Imagine this. So imagine and wonder how we end up getting copies of Paul's letter to Corinth, right? Because this ain't what we end up including in our canon. It is not the original copy of the original letter that was sent, right? It did not last that time. So that means that somebody, aka the church in Corinth, and potentially other communities that was then disseminated to, found those words so valuable that they replicated them, that they hired a scribe to copy it and recreate it so that those words would be saved for generations to come. Now imagine this as well. This is one of the things I think we don't think about enough. The fact that we've got this stuff 2,000 years later. And I'm not just talking about the difficulty in maintaining these words, but can you imagine telling Paul that his letters to these churches are going to be seen as canon by Orthodox Christianity 2,000 years in the future? Do you think he maybe would have done a 2nd or 3rd draft? or hired an editor at least? Do you think maybe he would have liked to have gone back and rewritten some of the stuff that he wrote when he was younger and a little more zealous in certain regards? So this is one of the things that I get so worked up about when people point to like a section of Paul and they're like, but this proves this. I'm like, no, it doesn't. I'm like, if you were to ask Paul what he thought about that, he would give you a different answer. Because if you ask me about something that I've preached on or lectured on or taught about, I would give you a different answer because I don't remember what I said. And I've changed. My theology has changed. My experiences have changed, etc. Same thing is true of Luke, Acts. Yeah.
Does he
Paul was, yeah.
Yeah, how was he able to get this out without them saying, I mean,
Well-
it was interesting that they allowed him to,
Well, number one, because I've already mentioned, it wasn't like modern day prison.
no,
He was basically house arrest, and they absolutely allowed people to come visit, right? So he wasn't sneaking things out,
no.
right? He was sending. And keep in mind that Paul being a political prisoner during this time means more that he was inconvenient to somebody in power at that point in time. He was imprisoned several times throughout his life. So obviously they let him out at some point.
His preaching would have been considered, because it was against whoever was in power.
See, but yes, and then this is the important thing to remember, and and I mentioned that the last couple of weeks is that the quote unquote persecution of Christianity waxes and wanes with time, and really has to do with who's emperor, who's the governor or the person in power in the locality that Paul finds himself at that point in time. Because one of the things that is hard for us is because we understand the applicability of our laws within the United States to be, federal laws at least, to be universal, right? Now that we're not bringing into that conversation what state laws conflict, all that, that's what the Supreme Court is for. But in Paul's day and age, there was quote unquote Roman law, right, that was applied or not applied, with different levels of intensity depending on where you were at. Because there are jokes about this, right? Like if you're at the frontier, how long does the arm of the Roman how long is the reach of Rome, right? Essentially is the question. Because if you're talking about Roman soldiers that are stationed up on Hadrian's Wall, what was life like up there? I'm getting into the weeds to a certain extent, but it's not like Paul is imprisoned in wherever that means that if he were to escape and go to Rome, that he would be arrested on sight. No, he was inconvenient in that place at that time, right? And and we could talk about persecution. Again, we've been given this image, not intentionally. Because I developed this image as well too, and I really had to convince myself otherwise that just being out in the street as a Christian was a risk. But in reality, nobody really cared, right? Until they cared. Nobody. Okay, here's a metaphor. I don't know if it's good or not. Imagine the difference between the day before and the day after Kristallnacht. Okay? So the day before, that's your neighbor who happens to be Jewish. You might not be extremely excited about that, but whatever, that's just the reality. The day after, suddenly it's illegal, right? The day after, suddenly it's a whole different thing. The day before, it's one thing. The day after, it's another thing. Now imagine, Paul or any of the other early Christians, by and large, no one really cares what you do on your own, right? Rumors, of course, were being spread. A lot of it was propaganda by certain aspects of the Roman Empire about the crazy things that Christians were up to, including cannibalism and baking babies into bread. But that's stuff that we kind of pull out of the woodwork and say, oh, but look at how bad it was. When in reality, across Rome, and I don't mean to diminish a lot of what these communities are going through, but it's not as crazy as we make it out to be. This isn't 1984 here, right? There's no surveillance state that's monitoring these people. So again, Paul being imprisoned, absolutely, they would allow messengers to come and go to prison. So you were reliant upon people to bring you food, to bring you clothing, to bring you blankets, to bring you bedding, to bring you water. So yeah, people are coming and going all the time. It's just he has to stay there.
I've got one other thing I'd like to add. We visited an old territory prison down in Yuma, or I don't know, someplace down there. And the prison, the cell somebody was in was probably as big as that.
Yeah.
And the bed was out of the limestone or whatever. The bars there, it was outside.
Yeah.
People could come and,
bring you food and water.
I imagine the prisons over there would be like that, but I might be wrong.
No, could well be, yeah. Bring you food and water. Yeah, or throw rotten vegetables at you, right? Yeah. Does that help, Gail? Does that kind of paint a picture? Yeah.
Probably a lot of my image of what was going on is Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's not just Hollywood. I mean, again, this is a whole other conversation. The modern prison system colors our thinking in a lot of ways. Right? That's a whole other conversation as well too. But when we think prison, we're thinking like, you know, maximum security, federal incarceration, federal penitentiary, you know, barbed wire, you know, gun turrets, the whole 9 yards. When those things did not exist in the first century. In fact, we got time for a little tangent, right? We've had this, you know, I've talked about this in the past, but like, you realize that prison did not exist in Hebrew society. You had two options, right? Well, three options. One, a fine. Two, exile. Three, stoning. That is the sum total of punishment that can be meted out for crimes, right? So if you read through the Levitical law, 9 times out of 10, if somebody does something wrong, they pay a fine for it. If you kill a neighbor's cow or yak or whatever, right, there is a cost associated with that. What happens in front of the magistrate is not so much levying of the cost as it is determining whose cow it was, on whose land the cow was, and whether or not the person in question actually killed that cow. Once that is decided, then they flip to the book of laws and they say it's this many whatever, right? Okay. If the crime falls into a different category, for example, you start getting into the realm of killing a person instead of an animal, or for a repeat offender, they would generally levy exile, so you would be kicked out of the community, which is death. It's just they're not the ones doing the killing, right? You might live, but the point is out of sight, out of mind. They're not our problem anymore. Stoning is reserved for very special circumstances, okay? Because that is essentially saying we can't even allow this person to walk somewhere else, okay? That is murder, okay? However, murder with an asterisk. Whether or not the murderer killed somebody who was involved in adultery will affect the outcome. And again, if the adulterer is a man versus a woman, that will affect the outcome. I mean, it's pretty patriarchal, misogynist. I mean, you know, let's be honest, it's Leviticus. But that's when stoning is involved, okay? And stoning seems really barbaric, and it is. However, keep in mind, we talked about this last week, I think. Cleanliness, huge issue. Getting blood on you makes you unclean. Also, you know, this is the executioner's dilemma, right? Who takes on the guilt of killing the person? The Jewish answer was everybody. Everybody has to participate in the stoning of somebody, because then we spread the blood guilt out. But then also because we're throwing the stones, we're not theoretically getting the blood on us as well too, right? So stoning, despite the fact that it occurred, you know, we get the almost stoning of the woman caught in adultery. Unfortunately, the guy was nowhere to be found, you know, as usual. It was not that prevalent. That was a punishment of last resort, you know.
I saw a cinematic depiction of stoning,
Mm.
and they actually had a canvas over the two people.
There you go.
So that also
Yeah.
prevented the blood from splattering, and then you weren't also seeing.
You weren't seeing the results of your violence. Yeah. Despite its portrayal in film, potentially, you know, I don't know that people participating in a stoning were necessarily wanting to be there. You know, it was not.
Sort of mobbish, but...
Yes, and now we're talking about something like the Salem witch trials, or, you know, where, you know, mob mentality becomes a thing. Sorry, we went off on a tangent, but I love tangents, so you know well about that.
Yeah, I told Ron it was a pretty big squirrel.
My stinking dogs. we have a bird feeder that is in front of the house, just outside the big picture windows. And Madeline, the older dog, she loves chasing squirrels. But what she will do is she will sit up with her paws on the front, the windowsill, and just stare at it. The little one barks. And I'm just like, dude, number one, even if I let you out there, you would not be able to catch the squirrel. So give up on it. Number two, it's a squirrel, dude.
But it's on.
It's on my porch that I peed on. So, this is maybe a minor thing, but it's worth talking about. At no point in the Luke Acts narrative does the author claim to be a direct witness of events, right? We read that last week when we read the introduction, is that, they kind of like point blank say, I have collected these things through research, et cetera, for the purpose of X, Y, Z. Again, it's directed towards Theophilus, who we imagine potentially was, all people who are loved by God or love God. Okay. Let us turn to Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 20. Well, we might go beyond 23. And let me see if I can find it in here. Luke 10, I need to go back. Luke 5, okay, we jumped ahead, 5.
Beatitudes.
The Beatitudes, yep. Matthew's. Yeah, it's Matthew. Okay. Sorry, I always have a hard time navigating these because they are Matthew-centric. Found it. Thank goodness. Holy Moses. I'm starting to get nervous there for a second. And they cut it up. Okay, I'm just going to pull it up here. No, I don't want to admit verse name. Okay. I always feel like I just preached on this because in reality the Beatitudes come up seemingly 15 times a year for different reasons. But let's just refresh ourselves. Where does the word beatitude come from? Anybody? It's a Latin word. Beatus, meaning happy or joyful. Beatific, right? Do we know this word? So it comes out of the language. The word in Greek is makarios, and it can be translated as blessed, happy, joyful. I preached a sermon maybe last year or 3 years ago about how we could also translate it as blessed are in terms of like, worthy of respect, I think was the phrase that I used. All those things are good. There are two versions of the Beatitudes. One exists in Matthew chapter 5. The other exists in Luke chapter 6. We're going to talk, well, let's read through them, then we'll talk about the contrast. Okay, so Jesus looks up at the disciples and he says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets." We're going to pause there. We'll come back to the following verses in a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to read Matthew's account. What we're doing is we're playing the old fun game that we used to play in preschool, which is different between these two. You remember where they would give you the pictures and you had to circle all the things that were different between the two pictures? That's what we're doing. Okay, but we'll talk about why we're doing it. Okay, here's Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit. You can go ahead, turn to Matthew chapter 5, rather than just having me read it out loud, if you want. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay. Let's circle the things. What's different between Matthew's account and Luke's account? Longer. Matthew is always longer. Matthew is very...
And it starts off with crowd in one case and disciples in the other. So
Ooh.
more of a niche versus everyone.
Thank you. That's a very insightful.
It's a more spiritual focus.
Yes.
And Luke is more literal.
Yes.
Poor are poor, not poor in spirit.
Yes. Yeah, right there, that first one, it's pretty straightforward. What else? Paula.
Luke directs his sermon to you.
Thank you.
Singular.
Yes.
I'm cheating.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Paula. You as well have a gospel parallel. That does make it easier. I said I was going to make copies of this week. I apologize. So Luke is using the direct address as opposed to the third person. Blessed are those, speaking of those people. Yeah, blessed are you who are poor. Yeah, makes a big difference. Yeah. Anything else? Did you notice, and again, if you've got a parallel in front of you like Paula and I do, because we're special, you would notice that the blessings are different between the two. For example, we already mentioned that Matthew spiritualizes a little bit, but Matthew includes a bunch of blessings that Luke doesn't. We could probably argue that he elaborates a little bit more. So, blessed are those who are mourn. That's not in Luke. Blessed are those who are meek. That's not in Luke. Blessed, and again, this is the spiritualization of blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness instead of those who are hungry now. Blessed are the merciful, not in Luke. Blessed are the pure in heart, not in Luke. Blessed are the peacemakers, not in Luke. Blessed are those who are persecuted, not in Luke. Do you see what's going on here? Okay. However, Luke, okay, don't jump ahead of myself. Okay, now here's the thing that's in Luke that is not in Matthew, which I always bring up. These are the verses that I stopped at. I've stopped at 23. Now I'm going to read 24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. Ugh. Yeah, and then we've talked. This isn't our first time looking at Luke's version of the Beatitudes, but that it's a gut punch, especially compared. Matthew is the soft touch. Luke is a little more direct. Now let's talk about the significance of this. So what do you think about the list of Luke's blessings versus Matthew's blessings? So yes, Matthew spiritualizes it a little bit more. In fact, he reframes it. Now, one of the questions we can ask here, which I don't know that there's a good answer for, but the question is, what were the original words? We have no idea. So this is one of those pieces which most likely is Q source stuff. We mentioned this the past couple weeks. because it is unique to the Matthew-Luke narrative. It is not in Mark. So what that means is that the authors of Matthew and Luke, when they were creating their gospel narrative, had Mark sitting here and another source over here, and this other source holds the account of the Beatitudes, okay? So we actually can't say with any confidence what the quote-unquote original words were. Now, I'm sure that there are scholars who have tried to argue, because like I mentioned last week, at one point in time, it was held that Matthew was potentially even a 2nd century gospel, so written sometime around 100, and that Luke was written earlier. But now more and more those two get pushed closer together. That Matthew and Luke were potentially written around the same time. Okay, so it has been argued that Luke's account is the earlier account, and that Matthew then spiritualizes Luke's account. In fact, at a very young age as a seminarian, I heard a sermon preached on that. I was lectured about how Matthew's account of the Beatitudes is awful because he spiritualizes things that are concrete and physical, and we should be talking more about people who are hungry and not just people who are hungry for righteousness. Right? It was a decent enough sermon. It stuck with me, obviously. But we don't know. Okay? So rather, let's talk about, in our remaining 5 to 10 minutes, what does it mean differently? And knowing potentially who Luke was and what Luke cared about, why might Luke have written these words as opposed to the words that Matthew writes? Okay. And it might not be connected. Maybe there is nothing to be had there, but we're not talking about what the right answer is. We're wondering about what's interesting. We're imagining what might this tell us about Luke or what Luke was trying to say. Linda.
Well, my first impression is that Luke is, because he does bring in the woe to you part, is that he's trying to make a different point of, straighten up and fly right because you're in trouble.
I love the Texan twang that came along with that. So Linda was saying perhaps Luke is bringing in the woes because he's also wanting to incorporate this sense of, like, as you put it, straighten up and get right, or otherwise you're in trouble. Yeah, I mean, again, with the direct address, you, it's very easy to be on the receiving end of that admonition on behalf of Luke. It's very easy to put ourselves in the place of the one who is having these words spoken, which I would argue, right, is one of the things that's important about the way that Luke writes this. Is, for me at least, I don't know about all you all, but when I read blessed are those, my first assumption is that Jesus is talking about somebody else, right? Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. I don't feel included in that, right? Even though I might be able to argue my way into being poor in spirit, my initial response is he's literally talking about that group of people, right? Which there's nothing wrong with that. When we get to Matthew, we'll talk about why it's important. However, when Luke says, "Blessed are you," I hear those words directed at me. So even from just how the writer is creating the narrative, right, there was some intentionality that Luke put into this, which is that I am intending the readers of this narrative to hear themselves spoken to. Now, here's the important part. Who was Luke writing to? Everybody. What might have been said about Gentile Christians during this period? That they're not included. Okay? One of the things that happens when we read Matthew's account, and this is because of who Matthew's audience is, and we'll get to Matthew when we get to Matthew. Matthew was writing to Jewish Christians, primarily. But one of the things that happens is that we hear those people. And it immediately makes us wonder, well, but does that include us? But if Luke is writing Luke's gospel, potentially from Antioch, smack dead in the middle of Gentile territory, who is likely getting copies of Luke's gospel? Gentiles. And they're reading it, and they're reading, "Blessed are you. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who weep. Blessed are you." And so it's much more universal. It's much more inclusive in a way that Matthew's gospel is probably, we can argue, trying to make a different theological point. This is not about who's better or worse, but Luke's gospel is more imminent. It's more present. It's more physical. And this is one of the things that we talked about last week as well, too, is that Luke, in the tradition of being a physician, cares about the body, right? And it's easy to minimalize that. But think about it this way. Does anybody have any friends that are, or you who have been involved in trade school type of work, plumbing, construction? Yeah, I know. I was going to pick on Rod, but or HVAC. What kind of metaphors do they use? Is the language different? Right? Has the work that they do changed how they think about the world? Absolutely. Absolutely. My experience is with farmers, growing up in a farming area, right? How people think even about seasons and schedules, the metaphors that they use are all related to the experiences and the profession that they have. Now imagine Luke being a physician. It's easy to minimize. Oh, he's a physician. Of course he's talking about the body. No. He's a physician. Therefore, one of the things that he really cares about, but also really expresses in his language, is the physicality of Jesus, the physicality of the gospel. So he's actually concerned about people who are hungry because he may have treated malnutrition as a physician. He's actually concerned about people who weep because he may have treated depression as a physician, right? So the words that he uses, the ways that he narrates the things that Jesus is saying, he's saying in a way that makes sense to him, in a way that he cares about, and he's thinking specifically of people that he knows and has experience. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? Gail?
Well, and under Luke, where he says, "Blessed are you who are poor," I wish they'd have put poorly, because there's a different sense there. Does he mean not having any money, whereas this is poor in spirit? That's a whole different thing.
In Matthew?
Yeah. So if I could see a physician saying, "Those of you that are poorly," in other words, not doing so well, not necessarily how much money.
But you could argue, this is one of the things that we even talk about in modern medical care as we talk about the social determinants of health, right? Is that people who are literally poor have worse health outcomes, right? Because of malnutrition and lack of access to good health care and all of the other things that go along with it. So it may be that Luke intentionally uses the word poor because, again, the people who he's treating are literally poor. Whereas, you can make the argument, in fact, that Matthew in this instance is more inclusive, right? Because poor in spirit is potentially something that more people can identify with, as opposed to Luke, poor is poor, right? Jim?
Is he focusing this on the disciples and the crowd overhearing it, or is he focusing?
Good question.
Because it's sort of like he's focusing on the disciples. You have a higher standard. You've got a standard here. If you're going to be my disciples, or is it directed at the crowd? Or do we know?
That kind of fits with the idea that the disciples, their issue might have been spirit.
Yeah, in Matthew.
With the Gentiles, their issue is being actually no money.
Yeah.
Being poor.
And here is the other big difference that we didn't talk about. The way that the Beatitudes fits into Matthew's account is it is the first speech that Jesus makes as part of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the kickoff message for the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke's gospel, we don't get that context. So what happens is Jesus chooses the 12 apostles. That's Luke verse 12 and onward. Then we get kind of like this summary statement of Jesus going around and healing. And he stands on a level place instead of a mountaintop. Okay, but then the image that's painted for us is there's a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people. Okay, and this is really important. A great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. Where are Tyre and Sidon? What modern day nation is that? Lebanon. So guess who's there? Non-Jews, Gentiles. Okay. So in Matthew's gospel, the narrative that happens is that Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee, reaches this high place. People from all around the region of Galilee arrive to hear Jesus speak. In Luke's gospel, Luke is naming the diversity of the people that are there. Again, ties in with it being directed at the Gentiles. Why does the account say, then he looked up at his disciples and spoke? Two ways you can go with this, and then we'll wrap up because we're already late today. Two ways you can go with this. One is that, and this is actually something that happens in Luke, is that Luke often has Jesus directly addressing the disciples, and we're meant to assume this happens with one of the harder stories to read later on, the crumbs to the dogs one. Okay. We'll get to that later. And we're meant to assume that everybody else is overhearing this teaching session that's occurring between Jesus and the 12. Okay, that's one way of reading it, and would be a correct way, right? These are not competitive assumptions. The other way is that when Luke says disciples, everybody's included. So everybody that came to hear Jesus speak and teach and be healed by Jesus is included in the crowd of apostles. They are now learners of Jesus. I can make arguments in both directions. I like the second one, especially because I know that Luke was not part of the 12. He was, a second circle disciple, right? So Luke would have associated himself with being in the greater crowd and would have seen himself as a disciple and apostle. All right, weather's nice outside. So for next week, this is what we're doing. I've got a couple more texts, and I will make copies next week, so you can all look at the parallel. You're not guessing what I'm reading. We're wrapping up Luke next week, and then it's on to Matthew. Oh no, not next. Wait. Not next week, because I am gone next week. Pastor Sandy Olson Decker is going to be here preaching and presiding, a daughter of MLC. I will be back for Pentecost, which is when we'll wrap up Luke, June 5th. Okay, I'm glad I caught myself.